The overseer's ledger sat open on the desk, its pages filled with neat columns of numbers and names. But on the morning of March 14, 1851, Thomas Garrett made an entry that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In the space reserved for unusual occurrences, he wrote just 4 words: "Another white infant found." It was the 7th in 3 months. The Henderson Plantation sprawled across 2,000 acres of Alabama cotton country, 20 miles south of Montgomery. 300 souls lived and worked within its boundaries, most of them enslaved, their lives measured in bales, picked and rows hoed. The plantation had operated for 40 years without incident, a model of efficiency that other landowners studied and envied. The enslaved population was stable, the yields consistent, the books balanced to the penny, until the babies started appearing. The first one was discovered on a frigid January morning by a woman named Ruth, who lived in cabin number 12 with her husband Daniel and their 3 children. She'd risen before dawn to fetch water from the well when she heard it, a thin, reedy cry coming from the doorway of the abandoned cabin next to hers. Cabin 13 had been empty for months, ever since its previous occupants had been sold downriver to settle a debt Colonel Henderson had incurred during a poor harvest season. Ruth found the infant wrapped in a flour sack, placed carefully on the rotting floorboards just inside the door. The child was perhaps 2 months old, with pale skin that seemed to glow in the pre-dawn darkness, and a shock of blonde hair so fine it was nearly white. The baby was clean, well-fed, and dressed in a cotton gown that, while simple, was far finer than anything the enslaved population would have access to. The stitching was precise and even, the kind of work that took time and skill. Ruth stood in the doorway for a long moment, the cold January wind cutting through her thin dress, staring at the infant. In her world, unexpected things were dangerous things. A white baby appearing in the slave quarters was the kind of event that could bring trouble down on everyone, guilty or innocent. But she was a mother, and the baby was crying, and some instincts ran deeper than fear. She picked up the child and brought it to the overseer's house. Thomas Garrett had been managing Henderson Plantation for 12 years. He was a methodical man of 43, neither cruel nor kind, who viewed his position as a job requiring organization and attention to detail. He'd come to Alabama from Virginia, where he'd learned plantation management under his father, who'd run a smaller operation in the Tidewater region. Garrett prided himself on running an orderly establishment. The enslaved population was healthy and productive. The equipment was maintained, the books balanced. The colonel trusted him, and that trust had been earned through years of consistent, reliable service. The appearance of an unexplained infant was, to him, primarily an administrative problem. White babies didn't simply materialize in slave quarters. Someone had to have brought it there. Someone had to know something, and it was his job to find out who and what. He questioned Ruth extensively in his office, a small building adjacent to the main house that served as the nerve center of plantation operations. The room was spare and functional. A desk, 2 chairs, shelves lined with ledgers documenting every aspect of the plantation's business. Ruth stood before him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes fixed on the floor as she'd been taught. Had she seen anyone near the cabins during the night? No, sir. Had she heard anything unusual? Footsteps, voices, the sound of a horse or wagon? No, sir. Did she recognize the flour sack or the gown the baby was wearing? No, sir. When exactly had she found the child? Just before dawn, sir, when she went to fetch water. Was there anything else unusual about the cabin or the area around it? No, sir. Ruth answered each question with increasing nervousness, aware that in the world she inhabited, being the bearer of strange news could be dangerous. She knew nothing. She'd seen nothing. She'd simply found the child and done what she thought was right. Garrett believed her. He'd been managing enslaved workers long enough to know when someone was lying, and Ruth's fear was genuine and uncomplicated. She was as mystified as he was. Garrett sent word to the main house, where Colonel Marcus Henderson and his wife resided. The colonel was in Montgomery on business, something about a cotton factor's contract that needed renegotiating, but Mrs. Elizabeth Henderson came down to the overseer's office within the hour. She was a tall woman in her 50s, with iron-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She'd been born into one of Virginia's old families and had brought both money and connections to her marriage. She was known for running the household with the same efficiency her husband applied to the fields, managing a staff of house servants with firm but fair discipline. She examined the infant with a practiced eye, her long fingers checking the baby's limbs, looking into its mouth, feeling the texture of the gown it wore. Mrs. Henderson had raised 4 children of her own and had overseen the births of countless enslaved infants on the plantation. She knew babies and she knew quality when she saw it. "This child has been well cared for," she said, her voice crisp and certain. "Look at the skin. No rashes, no signs of neglect. The baby's been bathed regularly and fed properly. And this gown, this is quality cotton, and the stitching is excellent. Someone with means has been looking after this baby, someone with access to good cloth and the skill to sew it properly. But who would leave it here?" Garrett asked. "And why in the slave quarters? If someone wanted to abandon a child, there are orphanages in Montgomery, churches that would take it in. Why bring it all the way out here and leave it in an empty cabin?" Mrs. Henderson had no answer. She wrapped the baby more securely in its cloth and arranged for one of the house servants to prepare a basket with supplies. "I'll take the child to the county orphanage myself," she said. "Mrs. Whitfield will know what to do with it. As for who left it here and why, that's a question for you and my husband to answer, Mr. Garrett. I suggest you begin investigating immediately." The matter, she assumed, was closed. An unfortunate incident, certainly, but not unprecedented. Babies were abandoned all the time for all sorts of reasons. This one would be cared for at the orphanage and eventually placed with a family. Life would go on. But 3 weeks later, it happened again. This time the baby was found in cabin 7, discovered by a man named Joseph when he returned from the fields at dusk. Joseph was a field hand in his 30s, strong and reliable, known for his steady work and quiet demeanor. He'd been married once, but his wife had died in childbirth 5 years earlier, and he'd never remarried. He lived alone in cabin 7, a small structure at the northern end of the quarters. When he pushed open his cabin door that evening, exhausted from a long day of clearing a new field for spring planting, he found a white infant lying on his sleeping pallet. Same circumstances as before. A white baby, perhaps 3 months old, wrapped in clean cloth, placed carefully as if someone had wanted to ensure it would be found immediately. The child was healthy, fed, and calm, its blue eyes staring up at the ceiling with the unfocused gaze of the very young. Joseph stood frozen in his doorway, his mind racing through the implications. A white baby in his cabin. If someone accused him of stealing it, of harming it, of anything at all, he could be killed. The fact that he'd done nothing wrong would mean nothing if the wrong person decided to make an accusation. But he also knew that hiding the baby or trying to move it would look even worse. He had no choice but to report it immediately. He brought the baby to the overseer's house, his hands shaking slightly as he handed the infant to Garrett. Garrett felt the first stirrings of genuine unease. One abandoned baby could be explained as a desperate mother's last resort, a tragedy born of poverty or shame. 2 suggested something more deliberate, more organized. Someone was choosing to leave these babies specifically at Henderson Plantation, specifically in the slave quarters. But why? He questioned Joseph with the same thoroughness he'd applied to Ruth and received the same answers. Nothing seen, nothing heard. The cabin had been empty when Joseph left for the fields at dawn. The baby had been there when he returned at dusk. No one else had been in the cabin. Joseph was certain of that. He kept his few possessions in a specific arrangement, and nothing had been disturbed except for the baby's placement on his pallet. This time, Garrett conducted a more thorough investigation. He walked through the slave quarters that night, checking for signs of unusual activity. He examined the ground around cabin 7 for footprints or wagon tracks. He questioned the other residents of the quarters, asking if anyone had seen strangers on the plantation or noticed anything out of the ordinary. He examined the cloth the baby had been wrapped in, looking for any identifying marks, a laundry mark, a particular weave pattern, anything that might indicate where it had come from. He found nothing. The cloth was good quality but unremarkable. The quarters had been quiet all day, no strangers, no unusual activity. The ground around cabin 7 showed only the normal traffic of people going about their daily routines. The second infant joined the first at the orphanage, delivered by Mrs. Henderson with a deepening sense of concern. 2 abandoned white babies in 3 weeks, both found in the same location. It was beginning to look less like coincidence and more like a pattern. Colonel Marcus Henderson returned from Montgomery 2 days later, and was briefed on the situation by both his wife and his overseer. He was a practical man of 58 who'd built his fortune through careful planning and calculated risk management. He'd inherited a modest plantation from his father and had expanded it through shrewd land purchases and efficient operations. He was respected in Montgomery society, served on the boards of 2 banks, and was frequently consulted by other planters on matters of agricultural technique and labor management. The appearance of unexplained white infants on his property represented both a mystery and a potential scandal. If word spread that babies were being abandoned at Henderson Plantation, it could damage his reputation and, more importantly, his business relationships. People might start asking questions. They might start wondering if there was something about his plantation that attracted such activity. They might begin to speculate about what was happening in his slave quarters that would make someone choose his property for such purposes. "Double the night watch," he ordered Garrett. "I want men patrolling the quarters every hour after dark. Post them at both ends of the quarters and have them walk the full length every hour. Whoever is doing this will be caught. They have to approach from somewhere, the road, the fields, the woods. Someone will see them." But the night watch found nothing. The patrols saw nothing. 2 men walked the quarters every hour from dusk until dawn, and they reported no unusual activity. The quarters remained quiet, the routines undisturbed. The enslaved population went to bed at their usual times and rose at their usual times. No one came or went who shouldn't have. And yet, 3 weeks after the second baby appeared, there was a third. This one was found in cabin 19, in the southern section of the quarters farthest from the main house. A woman named Hannah discovered it when she woke to feed her own infant in the middle of the night. Hannah was 24, the mother of 3 children, married to a man named Samuel who worked as a carpenter on the plantation. She was known as a light sleeper, made more so by years of waking to tend to babies in the night. She'd heard no footsteps, no doors opening, no sounds of any kind. Her husband slept beside her, snoring softly. Her 3 children were asleep on their pallets in the corner. But there, in the other corner of the cabin where there had been nothing before, was another white baby, wrapped in the same type of clean cloth, wearing the same type of simple but well-made gown. Hannah's scream woke half the quarters. By the time Garrett arrived, a crowd had gathered outside cabin 19. The enslaved population was frightened now, their fear palpable in the cold March air. In their world, unexplained events were dangerous. Strange occurrences drew attention, and attention from the white overseers and owners was rarely good. Whispers spread through the crowd, whispers of haints and spirits, of curses and omens. Some of the older people remembered stories from their childhoods, tales of supernatural beings that could move unseen and leave signs of their presence. Others spoke of warnings, of messages from the dead, of punishments for unnamed sins. Garrett dispersed the crowd with sharp orders, sending people back to their cabins. He couldn't afford to have panic spreading through the quarters. Frightened workers were unproductive workers, and the spring planting season was approaching. He needed everyone focused on their tasks, not jumping at shadows and spreading wild stories. He took possession of the third infant and brought it to his office. This time, examining the baby more carefully in the lamplight, he noticed something he'd missed before. The child had a small birthmark on its left shoulder, a distinctive port wine stain in the shape of a crescent moon. It was the kind of mark a mother would recognize instantly, the kind of identifying feature that couldn't be hidden or disguised. He made a note of it in his ledger, adding it to the growing file on the mysterious babies. 3 infants in 2 months. All white, all healthy, all well cared for. All appearing overnight in slave cabins despite increased security. It was beginning to feel less like a criminal matter and more like something he couldn't quite name. Something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up when he thought about it too long. The 4th baby appeared in early March, found in cabin 23 by an elderly woman named Sarah, who'd lived on the plantation for 40 years. She discovered it at dawn, placed just inside her door as if someone had known she would be the first to wake. Sarah was known as a healer, someone who knew herbs and remedies, who was called upon when children fell ill or women went into difficult labor. She looked at the white baby with eyes that had seen too much, wrapped it more securely, and brought it to Garrett without a word. The 5th came a week later in cabin 4, found by a young couple who'd been married just 6 months. The 6th was discovered in cabin 16 by a man who worked in the stables. Each time, the pattern was the same. A white infant, healthy and well cared for, appearing overnight in or near a slave cabin with no explanation. Each time, despite increased patrols and heightened vigilance, no one saw or heard anything suspicious. The enslaved population grew more frightened with each discovery. Work in the fields became tense, productivity dropped, and Garrett found himself dealing with an increasingly anxious workforce. People were afraid to sleep, afraid to wake, afraid of what they might find. The white overseers and drivers were equally unsettled. In a world built on control and order, the babies represented chaos, something happening that couldn't be explained or prevented. Garrett increased security again. He posted guards at the entrances to the quarters. He had men patrol the boundaries of the plantation. He even brought in dogs, thinking they might alert to the presence of strangers. But nothing worked. The babies kept appearing and no one could explain how. Colonel Henderson called a meeting of his senior staff in mid-March. In addition to Garrett, this included Benjamin Cross, his head driver, William Porter, his stable master, and Margaret Sullivan, his wife's personal assistant who managed the household staff. They gathered in the colonel's study, a room lined with books and ledgers that represented 40 years of careful record-keeping. "Gentlemen and Mrs. Sullivan," the colonel said, standing behind his desk with his hands clasped behind his back. "We have a problem that defies conventional explanation. 6 white infants have appeared on this plantation over the course of 2 months. Despite our best efforts, increased patrols, guard dogs, constant vigilance, we have no idea who is leaving them or why. This situation cannot continue. It's affecting productivity, morale, and my reputation. I need solutions, not excuses." "Could it be someone from outside the plantation?" Porter suggested. He was a lean man in his 40s who'd worked with horses all his life. "Someone using our property as a convenient dumping ground, maybe someone from Montgomery who knows the layout of the plantation." "The patrols would have seen them," Garrett replied. "We have men watching the roads and the boundaries. No one has entered or left the plantation at night without being logged in the gatebook. I've checked every entry personally. The only people coming and going are authorized. Merchants making deliveries, neighbors on social calls, all during daylight hours." "Then it must be someone inside," Cross said. He was a hard man, the head driver, responsible for managing the field workers. He'd held his position for 8 years and ruled through a combination of intimidation and strategic cruelty. Someone who knows the routines and can move without being noticed. Someone who has access to the quarters. "But who?" Mrs. Sullivan asked. She was a woman in her late 30s, educated and sharp, who'd been with the Henderson family for 15 years. "And more importantly, where are these babies coming from? 6 infants don't simply appear from nowhere. Someone is giving birth to these children, and someone is caring for them before they're abandoned. That requires resources, food, cloth, time, privacy. Where is all of this happening?" It was a question no one could answer. The implications were staggering. If someone on the plantation was hiding multiple babies, they would need a secure location, supplies, and help. It couldn't be done alone. But if multiple people were involved, how had they kept it secret? How had no one noticed? There's another possibility, Mrs. Sullivan said quietly. What if the babies aren't being hidden on the plantation? What if they're being brought here from somewhere else? Somewhere close enough that the person can make the trip in a few hours, but far enough away that we wouldn't think to look there. You mean Montgomery? The colonel asked. Or one of the neighboring plantations? Or a house in the countryside? Somewhere within a few hours' ride? The colonel considered this. That would require someone with access to transportation, a horse or wagon. Someone who could leave their location at night and return before dawn without being missed. Or someone who has a legitimate reason to travel, Garrett added. A merchant, a doctor, a minister. Someone whose comings and goings wouldn't be questioned. The meeting continued for another hour, but produced no concrete answers. The colonel made a decision. We'll conduct a census. Every person on this plantation will be accounted for and examined. If there are women who've recently given birth, we'll know about it. If there are supplies being diverted, we'll find them. If there are hidden spaces where babies could be kept, we'll discover them. This mystery will be solved. The census began the next day. It was a massive undertaking, 300 people to be documented, questioned, and in the case of women of childbearing age, physically examined by Mrs. Henderson and Dr. Robert Chambers, the plantation's physician. Dr. Chambers was a man in his 60s who'd been treating the Henderson family and their enslaved population for 20 years. He was thorough and professional, but the examinations were deeply invasive and humiliating for the women subjected to them. The process took nearly 2 weeks and was deeply unpopular. The enslaved population resented the intrusion, the questions, the physical examinations. The fear that had been building since the first baby appeared now mixed with anger and resentment. Garrett could feel the tension in the quarters, could see it in the way people avoided eye contact and spoke in whispers when the overseers passed. The results of the census were baffling. Every woman who'd given birth in the past year was accounted for, and their children matched the expected descriptions. There were no hidden pregnancies, no unexplained absences that would suggest a woman had given birth in secret. The supplies were all accounted for. The cloth, the thread, the food stores. Nothing was missing that couldn't be explained by normal usage. The cabins were searched, the outbuildings examined. Even the woods around the plantation were combed for signs of hidden structures or caches of supplies. Nothing. They found absolutely nothing. And yet, on the night the census was completed, an 8th baby appeared. This one was found in cabin 9, discovered by a young woman named Clara, who'd been living alone since her mother's death the previous fall. Clara was 17, quiet and withdrawn, known for keeping to herself. She worked in the main house as a laundry maid, one of the few enslaved people who had regular access to the household's inner workings. She was small and thin, with large, dark eyes that seemed to see more than she should. When she found the baby in her cabin that morning, she didn't scream or raise an alarm. Instead, she picked up the child, wrapped it more securely in its cloth, and sat with it until morning, rocking it gently and humming a tune her mother had taught her years ago. When Garrett came to collect the infant, alerted by one of the other residents who'd seen Clara sitting in her doorway with a white baby, he found her still rocking the child. There was something in her expression that made him pause, something that went beyond the fear and confusion he'd seen in the others who'd found babies. This was different. This was a deep, profound sadness, as if Clara understood something the rest of them didn't. "Did you see who left this child?" he asked, his voice gentler than usual. Clara shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving the baby's face. "Did you hear anything during the night? Any sounds at all?" Another shake of the head. "Clara, I need you to tell me if you know anything about these babies. Anything at all. You won't be punished for telling the truth, but I need to know what's happening." Clara looked up at him then, and Garrett saw tears streaming down her face. "They're lost," she whispered. "All of them. They're lost, and someone's trying to save them." Save them from what? But Clara wouldn't say anything more. She handed over the baby and retreated into her cabin, closing the door behind her. Garrett stood outside for a moment, disturbed by the encounter. There had been something in Clara's voice, something that suggested she knew more than she was saying. But he couldn't force her to talk, not without risking making the situation worse. He reported the conversation to Colonel Henderson, who ordered Clara brought to the main house for questioning. But when Cross, the head driver, went to fetch her an hour later, he found cabin 9 empty. Clara had vanished, taking nothing with her but the clothes on her back. A search party was organized immediately. In the world of 1851 Alabama, an enslaved person disappearing was a serious matter, not just for the financial loss, but for what it represented. If Clara had run, others might follow. If she'd been taken, there were implications about security that couldn't be ignored, and if she'd simply hidden somewhere on the plantation, she needed to be found before she starved or came to harm. They found her 3 hours later, hiding in the old tobacco barn on the eastern edge of the property. The barn hadn't been used in years, not since the colonel had shifted entirely to cotton production in the 1840s. It was a large, decaying structure with a collapsed roof and walls that let in the wind. Clara was huddled in a corner, shivering from cold and fear. Cross dragged her out roughly, but Garrett intervened. "Carefully," he said. "The colonel wants to question her, and he can't do that if she's injured or too frightened to speak." They brought Clara to the main house, to the colonel's study, where Henderson, his wife, and Garrett waited. Clara stood before them, thin and trembling, her eyes fixed on the floor. She looked even smaller in the grand room, surrounded by books and furniture that represented wealth beyond anything she would ever know. Colonel Henderson studied her for a long moment before speaking. When he did, his voice was surprisingly gentle. "Clara, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to punish you for running. I just need you to tell me the truth. Do you know where these babies are coming from?" "No, sir." "Do you know who's been leaving them?" "No, sir." "But you said something to Mr. Garrett. You said they were lost and someone was trying to save them. What did you mean by that?" Clara was silent for a long moment, her thin shoulders hunched as if she were trying to make herself disappear. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "My mama used to tell me stories about the old days before she came here. She said there were places where babies weren't wanted, where they were born and then given away, hidden, made to disappear." "What kind of places?" Mrs. Henderson asked, leaning forward in her chair. "Big houses, rich houses, places where a baby being born at the wrong time or to the wrong person would cause shame. She said sometimes the babies would just vanish and no one would ask questions because asking questions was dangerous." "And what happened to these babies?" the colonel asked. "Sometimes they died. Sometimes they were sold. Sometimes they were given to people who would take them far away, where no one would ever know where they came from." Clara's voice grew even quieter. "Mama said it was one of the secret things. One of the things everyone knew about, but no one talked about. She said the big houses had lots of secrets, and the babies were just one of them." The room fell silent as the implications settled over them. Colonel Henderson exchanged a long look with his wife, and Garrett saw something pass between them, a recognition perhaps, or a shared understanding of something he wasn't privy to. "Are you suggesting," Henderson said slowly, "that these infants are being abandoned here because someone wants to hide their existence? That they're illegitimate children from wealthy families?" "I don't know, sir. I'm just telling you what my mama told me, that sometimes when people have secrets they can't keep, they find places to hide them, places where no one will ask questions, places where the babies might be found and cared for, but where the scandal would be contained." It was a theory that made a terrible kind of sense. The Henderson plantation was isolated enough to be discreet, but established enough to have connections to Montgomery society. The colonel and his wife attended social functions, did business with the city's prominent families, moved in circles where reputation was everything. If someone in that world needed to dispose of an inconvenient infant, the product of an affair perhaps, or a pregnancy that would ruin a reputation, the plantation's slave quarters would be an ideal location. The babies would be found and cared for, but the scandal would be contained. The white families of Montgomery would never need to know that their peers had produced illegitimate children. But it was just a theory. There was no proof. No evidence beyond the babies themselves and Clara's second-hand stories from a mother who was now dead. Colonel Henderson sent Clara back to the quarters with a warning to keep her speculations to herself and to never run again. Then he sat in silence for a long time, staring at the ledgers on his desk. Finally, he looked at Garrett. "I'm going to Montgomery," he said. "I'm going to speak with Sheriff Crane. This has gone beyond a plantation matter. If what Clara suggests is true, if someone in Montgomery society is using my property for such purposes, then the law needs to be involved." He left that afternoon, riding hard for the city. Garrett watched him go, then returned to his office and made another entry in his ledger. 8 babies in 10 weeks, and still no answers. But that night, something changed. The 9th baby appeared, but this time, there was a witness. A young man named Marcus, who worked as a stable hand, had been unable to sleep. He'd been feeling ill all day, a stomach ailment that kept him awake and uncomfortable. Around midnight, he'd left his cabin to relieve himself in the woods behind the quarters. As he was returning, he saw something that made him freeze in his tracks. A figure was moving through the quarters, carrying something wrapped in cloth. The figure was dressed in dark clothing and moved with purpose, heading toward cabin 12, the same cabin where the first baby had been found months earlier. Marcus watched as the figure approached the cabin, paused at the door, and then placed the bundle inside. Then the figure turned and walked quickly back the way it had come, heading not toward the road or the woods, but toward the main house. Marcus waited until the figure was out of sight, then ran to cabin 12. Inside, he found the 9th baby, wrapped in the now familiar clean cloth. He immediately went to wake Garrett. By the time Garrett arrived, Marcus was agitated and frightened, speaking quickly and stumbling over his words. But his story was clear. He'd seen someone leave the baby, someone who'd come from the direction of the main house and returned there after placing the infant. Garrett felt his blood run cold. The main house. Not an outsider. Not someone from Montgomery. Someone who lived on the plantation. Someone with access to the main house. Someone who could move through the quarters without raising suspicion because they belonged there. He questioned Marcus extensively, trying to get more details. Had Marcus seen the person's face? No, it was too dark and they'd been wearing a hood or bonnet. Could he tell if it was a man or woman? He thought it was a woman, based on the way she moved, but he couldn't be certain. How tall was the person? Average height, not particularly tall or short. Was there anything distinctive about their clothing or the way they walked? Nothing he could identify. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd had before. Garrett made Marcus swear to keep quiet about what he'd seen, then took the baby and sat in his office, thinking. Someone from the main house. That narrowed the possibilities considerably. The main house staff consisted of about 15 people. House servants, cooks, personal attendants. All of them enslaved except for Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Sullivan. Could it be one of the house servants? But they were all accounted for, all watched closely by Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Sullivan. Their movements were tracked, their duties supervised. It would be nearly impossible for one of them to hide a pregnancy, give birth and care for multiple babies without being noticed. Unless they weren't hiding the babies on the plantation at all. Unless they were being brought from somewhere else, as Mrs. Sullivan had suggested. But that would require transportation, access to a horse or wagon, the ability to leave and return without being noticed. Garrett sat in his office until dawn, turning the problem over in his mind. Then he made a decision. He would watch the main house. Not obviously, not in a way that would alert whoever was responsible. But he would pay attention to comings and goings, to who had access to transportation, to who might have the opportunity to travel to Montgomery or elsewhere without raising suspicion. When Colonel Henderson returned from Montgomery 2 days later, Garrett briefed him on Marcus's sighting. The colonel listened in silence, his face growing more troubled with each detail. "Did you speak with the sheriff?" Garrett asked. "I did." The colonel's voice was heavy. He was less than helpful. He suggested that pursuing this matter too aggressively might cause problems. He implied that there were people in Montgomery who would not appreciate questions being asked about illegitimate children and abandoned babies. He refused to investigate. He said he would make discreet inquiries, but he made it clear that he expected those inquiries to lead nowhere. He said some mysteries are better left unsolved for everyone's sake. Garrett felt a chill run down his spine. "Sir, are you saying the sheriff knows something about this? That he's protecting someone?" "I'm saying that Sheriff Crane is a political animal who's held his position for 15 years by knowing when to look the other way. And he's made it clear that this is one of those times. But the babies are being cared for at the orphanage. They're safe. They'll be adopted by good families. As far as the sheriff is concerned, no crime has been committed. Abandoning a child isn't illegal if the child is left somewhere it will be found and cared for. So we just let this continue." Colonel Henderson was quiet for a long moment. "I'm going to tell you something in confidence, Mr. Garrett. Something that doesn't leave this room. The sheriff suggested to me that if I were to discover who was leaving these babies, the best course of action would be to quietly make it stop. Not to prosecute, not to make a scandal, but simply to ensure it doesn't happen again. He said that would be in everyone's best interest. Mine, the Plantations, and Montgomery societies. He's asking you to cover it up. He's asking me to be practical. And perhaps he's right. Perhaps the best thing for everyone is to solve this quietly and move on." But Garrett couldn't let it go. That night he began his surveillance of the main house. He positioned himself in the trees behind the building, where he could see the back entrance and the path that led to the quarters. He watched for 3 nights and saw nothing unusual. The house servants came and went on their normal schedules. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Sullivan moved about their duties. Everything appeared routine. On the 4th night, he saw something that made his breath catch. Around 11 o'clock, a figure emerged from the back door of the main house. It was a woman, dressed in a dark cloak, carrying a bundle. She moved quickly and quietly down the path toward the quarters. Garrett followed at a distance, staying in the shadows. The woman went to cabin 7, Joseph's cabin, where the second baby had been found. She placed the bundle inside, paused for a moment as if listening, then turned and walked quickly back toward the main house. Garrett got a better look at her as she passed through a patch of moonlight. It was Mrs. Sullivan. Garrett stood frozen, his mind reeling. Mrs. Sullivan, the colonel's wife's personal assistant, a woman who'd been with the family for 15 years, who was trusted implicitly, who had access to everything in the household. She was the one leaving the babies. But why? And where were the babies coming from? Garrett waited until Mrs. Sullivan had returned to the main house, then went to cabin 7. Inside, he found the 10th baby, wrapped in the familiar clean cloth. He picked up the infant and brought it to his office, his mind racing. He had to tell the colonel. But what would happen then? Mrs. Sullivan would be questioned, possibly arrested. The scandal would be enormous. And if the sheriff was right, if these babies were connected to prominent Montgomery families, the fallout could destroy the colonel's reputation and business. Garrett sat in his office holding the baby, trying to decide what to do. Finally, as dawn broke, he made his decision. He would confront Mrs. Sullivan first, privately. He would find out the truth before involving the colonel. Perhaps there was an explanation, a reason that would make sense of all this. He waited until mid-morning, when he knew Mrs. Henderson would be occupied with household matters, and the colonel would be in the fields. Then he went to the main house and asked to speak with Mrs. Sullivan privately. They met in the small sitting room off the main parlor, a room used for informal meetings and correspondence. Mrs. Sullivan looked calm and composed, showing no sign of guilt or nervousness. She sat in a chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, and waited for Garrett to speak. "I saw you last night," he said without preamble. "I saw you leave the house with a baby and place it in cabin 7. Mrs. Sullivan's expression didn't change. "I see. I need you to tell me what's happening. Where are these babies coming from? Why are you leaving them in the quarters?" Mrs. Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, studying him. Then she sighed. "Mr. Garrett, there are things in this world that are better left unknown. Secrets that once revealed cause more harm than good. I would advise you to forget what you saw and let this matter rest." "I can't do that. 10 babies have appeared on this plantation in 3 months. The enslaved population is frightened. The Colonel's reputation is at risk. I need answers. And if those answers destroy lives, if they ruin reputations and tear families apart, would you still insist on knowing? The truth is the truth, Mrs. Sullivan. Whatever it is, it needs to come out." Mrs. Sullivan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the plantation grounds. When she spoke again, her voice was soft and sad. "The babies are from Montgomery, from families you would recognize, families with names and reputations that matter in this state. They're the children of affairs, of indiscretions, of moments of weakness that produced consequences their parents couldn't acknowledge." So Clara was right. They're illegitimate children being hidden to avoid scandal. It's more complicated than that, Mr. Garrett. These aren't just unwanted babies being discarded. They're children whose very existence threatens their family's standing in society. If their births were known, marriages would be destroyed, fortunes would be lost, reputations would be ruined. The mothers can't keep them, and the fathers won't acknowledge them. So they're brought here, where they'll be found and cared for, but where their origins will remain hidden. And you're the one bringing them? Why? What's your connection to these families? Mrs. Sullivan turned to face him. "Because I'm one of them, Mr. Garrett. Or I was once. Before I came to work for the Hendersons, I lived in Montgomery. I moved in society, attended the same parties, knew the same people. And I made the same mistakes some of these women are making now. I had a child I couldn't keep, a baby that would have destroyed my family if its existence became known. Someone helped me then, helped me hide my shame and find a place for my child. Now I'm doing the same for others. But why here? Why the Henderson plantation? Because Mrs. Henderson knows, she's known from the beginning. This is done with her permission, with her help. She provides the cloth, the supplies, the means to care for the babies before they're placed. She ensures they're taken to the orphanage and placed with good families. She does this because she understands what it's like to have secrets, to need help, to be desperate. Garrett felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Mrs. Henderson is part of this. She's the reason it's possible. Without her help, these babies would have been left to die, or sold to people who would treat them as commodities. This way, they have a chance at a good life. They're adopted by families who want them, who will raise them as their own. It's not perfect, Mr. Garrett, but it's better than the alternatives. Does the Colonel know? Mrs. Sullivan hesitated. No, and he can't know. If he learns the truth, he'll feel obligated to act. He'll report it to the authorities, and the scandal will destroy everyone involved. The mothers, the families, even the babies themselves. The children will be marked as bastards, their adoptive families will be questioned, their entire lives will be tainted by their origins. Is that what you want? Garrett sat down heavily, his mind reeling. This is wrong. All of it. The deception, the secrecy, using the plantation without the Colonel's knowledge. It's mercy, Mr. Garrett. Imperfect mercy, perhaps, but mercy nonetheless. These women have nowhere else to turn. If we don't help them, their babies will die or disappear into situations far worse than an orphanage. We're saving lives. By lying to everyone, by frightening the enslaved population, by putting the Colonel's reputation at risk. The enslaved population will recover. The Colonel's reputation is intact. No one outside the plantation knows about the babies, and the sheriff has made it clear he won't pursue the matter. And yes, we're lying. We're lying to protect people who made mistakes, who are desperate, who have no other options. Is that so terrible? Garrett didn't know how to answer. Everything Mrs. Sullivan said made a kind of sense, but it still felt wrong. The deception, the manipulation, the use of the plantation and its people without their knowledge or consent, it all violated something fundamental about the order and honesty he'd tried to maintain. "What happens now?" he asked finally. "That depends on you. You can go to the colonel and tell him everything. The operation will end, the women will have nowhere to turn, and the babies will suffer. Or you can keep this secret, let the last few placements happen, and then it will be over. There are only 2 more babies to place, and then the women involved will have moved on, had their children adopted through other means, or found other solutions. This chapter will close, and life will return to normal. And if I agree to stay silent, I become part of the deception. You become part of the mercy, Mr. Garrett. You become someone who chose compassion over rules, who understood that sometimes the right thing to do isn't the legal thing or the proper thing. You become someone who saved lives." Garrett sat in silence, wrestling with the decision. Finally, he looked up at Mrs. Sullivan. 2 more babies. And then it stops. Completely. No more placements, no more secrets. And if the colonel ever asks me directly, I won't lie to him. Agreed. Garrett left the main house feeling as if he'd aged years in a single morning. He'd come seeking truth and had found it, but the truth was more complicated and morally ambiguous than he'd imagined. He'd become complicit in a conspiracy, but a conspiracy aimed at saving lives. He'd chosen to deceive his employer, but in service of a greater mercy. He didn't know if he'd made the right choice. He suspected he'd spend the rest of his life wondering. The 11th baby appeared a week later, found in cabin 16. The 12th and final baby was discovered 2 weeks after that, in cabin 4. Both times Garrett knew it was Mrs. Sullivan leaving them, but he said nothing. He documented the findings in his ledger, arranged for the babies to be taken to the orphanage, and kept his silence. After the 12th baby, the placement stopped. No more infants appeared in the quarters. The enslaved population slowly relaxed, though the memory of those strange months lingered. Work returned to normal, productivity recovered, and life on the Henderson plantation continued as it had before. Colonel Henderson never learned the truth. He assumed the person responsible had been frightened off by the increased security and the sheriff's involvement. He was satisfied that the problem had resolved itself and saw no reason to pursue it further. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Sullivan never spoke of it, even to each other. The secret remained locked between them, a shared understanding that required no words. Garrett kept his silence, but he never forgot. In his private journal, he recorded everything he'd learned, sealing the pages with wax and hiding them in a locked drawer. He wrote that he didn't know if he'd done the right thing, but he hoped that somewhere 12 children were growing up safe and loved, unaware of the desperate circumstances of their births and the complicated mercy that had saved them. The 12 babies were indeed adopted from the orphanage over the following 2 years. Mrs. Whitfield, the orphanage director, kept careful records and ensured each child went to a good family. She never knew the full story behind their appearances at Henderson Plantation, but she suspected there was more to it than simple abandonment. She kept her suspicions to herself and focused on giving the children the best possible start in their new lives. Years passed. The Civil War came and destroyed the old order. Henderson Plantation was burned during a raid in 1863, and the colonel died shortly after. His fortune and his world gone. Mrs. Henderson survived the war, but lived in reduced circumstances, dependent on the charity of relatives. She never spoke of the babies, and the secret died with her in 1869. Mrs. Sullivan moved to Mobile after the war and worked as a teacher. She never married, never had other children. She died in 1881, taking her full knowledge of the conspiracy to her grave. Thomas Garrett continued as an overseer on various plantations until the war made his profession obsolete. After emancipation, he worked as a farm manager and eventually retired to a small house in Montgomery. He died in 1889, and his journal was discovered among his effects. His children read it with shock and confusion, unable to reconcile the story it told with the father they'd known. They debated what to do with it, and finally decided to burn it, believing some secrets were too dangerous to preserve. But before they burned it, one of Garrett's daughters made a copy of the key pages, hiding them in her own diary. That diary survived and was eventually donated to a historical society in the 1940s. The pages about the babies were discovered by a researcher in 1963, but by then everyone involved was long dead and the story couldn't be verified. It remained a curious footnote in the history of antebellum Alabama, a mystery that might have been true or might have been the imaginings of a troubled man. The 12 babies grew up, lived their lives, and died without ever knowing their true origins. Some of them had children and grandchildren, spreading their bloodlines across Alabama and beyond. They were teachers and merchants, farmers and craftsmen, mothers and fathers who lived ordinary lives marked by the usual joys and sorrows. But in their blood, they carried a secret. They were the children of scandal and desperation, saved by a conspiracy of women who'd understood that sometimes mercy requires deception, and that sometimes the right thing to do is the thing that can never be acknowledged or praised. The slave quarters of Henderson Plantation rotted away over the decades, reclaimed by the Alabama soil. The main house was never rebuilt after the fire. The land was sold and resold, divided and subdivided, until nothing remained of the plantation that had once been a model of efficiency and order. But the question remained, whispered in the dark corners of Montgomery society, passed down through generations like a ghost story that might be true. What really happened in those slave cabins in the spring of 1851? Where did those babies come from? And what terrible secret was so important that it had to be erased from history? The truth, as Garrett had discovered, was both simpler and more complicated than anyone imagined. It was a story of desperate women and impossible choices, of secrets that couldn't be kept and children who couldn't be acknowledged. It was a story of mercy offered in the only way possible, through deception and conspiracy. It was a story of people trying to do right in a world that offered only wrong choices. And perhaps that's the most unsettling truth of all. That sometimes the only way to save something is to hide it. That sometimes love looks like abandonment and mercy looks like cruelty. That sometimes the people we think we know are carrying secrets so heavy they change the shape of their souls. The Henderson Plantation is gone now, marked only by a historical plaque that mentions cotton production and Civil War history. It says nothing about white babies appearing in slave cabins, nothing about mysteries that were never officially solved. Nothing about the 3 months in 1851 when something inexplicable happened, and then stopped, and then was systematically erased from every official record. But the land remembers. The soil remembers. And somewhere in the fading pages of hidden diaries and the whispered stories of descendants, the truth still exists, waiting to be found or waiting to remain hidden forever. Because some secrets once buried are meant to stay that way, and some truths once known can never be unknown. The 12 babies of Henderson Plantation were saved by a conspiracy of silence. They lived because people chose mercy over honesty, compassion over rules. They survived because women who understood desperation helped other women in their darkest hours. And they never knew. They never knew that their lives began in scandal and were saved by deception. They never knew that their very existence was a secret so dangerous